today. Very quickly, introductions. I know I gave a short intro yesterday, but Michael Ivie, I'm the managing partner at Michael Consulting, and I head our financial services practice. And for anyone that missed it yesterday, we are a global professional services firm headquartered here out of New York with offices in Charlotte, Tampa, Canada, UK, and so on. And our core businesses around data management and analytics, but subject matter aligned to things like Treasury and ALM, financial crimes, core banking, commercial lending, and things like that. So excited to have a presentation with you today. My background in my career, I started out actually working in broker-dealer operations, and before I was even 18 years old, I'm fortunate enough to know exactly what I want to do when I grow up, be very passionate about it, and none of the banks would hire me. So I took what I could get, and but excited as soon as I turned 18, getting licensed and getting in the business side of things, because that's where in TV everyone wants to work, is on the business side. And so had a few fun years on the business side, but then 2008, the financial crisis happened, and it created an opportunity for me to move to the risk management side of things and apply a lot of that business and operational knowledge to the risk management domain. Initially in credit risk, but then following that intellectual curiosity down the rabbit hole into the rest of the financial risk and market and liquidity, and ultimately non-financial risk. And then next thing I know, I'm an enterprise risk manager. And after a few years of implementing various risk programs and organizations, I wanted to move into management consulting. I've met a lot of you over the course of the last day and today. And a lot of people's personality is you like to build things, you like to solve problems and do things. So for me, I don't love running a BAU process. Sometimes it's nice to see how it continues on after you're gone. But management consulting is a great place for me, so that's what I've been doing for the last 10 years, originally in banking analytics at Accenture, and here at Fighting for the last 6 years or so. But with me today also is Chandra. I'm going to talk a lot at the end of the presentation about how we take this regulatory landscape and how we really bring that strong data management, data governance discipline to it with this specific Treasury ALM focus. But Chandra, I'll turn it over to you. If you have a preference where you want to stand.
So thank you, Mike. I'm Chandra Dasari. I have been with Fighting from last 2 years. Before that, I have about 20 plus years experience serving a lot of global GSIBs, both in US, UK, and Canada, primarily in the Treasury and risk space. I have been in the ALM world before 2008, but after that, my focus has been primarily on the liquidity reporting, whether it is Basel III, OCR, NCCF, or OSRI. In the last 25 years, I was very fortunate to work for more than 20 large firms with their treasury and helping them out to set up the right liquidity frameworks so that they are always ready for what is coming in, whether it is 5G, 6G, or you can talk about 7G also. So that's it. I'll try to present some of my insights of how the liquidity evolved over time, and what is that firms are looking at, what are some of the key challenges, and what do we do beyond just regulatory reporting that we have today. So here is our point of view. You can see the regulatory started with Lehman Brothers collapse in 2008. They wanted to have something rushed out. LCR came out from the Basel and other place, but then they soon realized one liquidity metrics is not good enough. So how do we go into understanding this liquidity space? Even regulators don't have too much of insight into how this entire reporting has to be. So they started with at least from the Fed, they started with 3G, 4G, and then it became 5G and 6G. But that imposed lot of additional work for the firms. One, to comply. Two, to get all these things in place. You can see that when it used to be quarterly, then it moved to monthly, and now with 6G, it has to be daily. And the requirement is T+2, which means the entire dump of your firm has to be ready with 2 days lag, which means enormous data sourcing, processing, then generating, projecting, estimating, and then putting it in a right format so it makes sense. So that is one of the big challenges. The second challenge is it's not just report. What is the framework we are using to do these things? So how robust is your framework? Do you have controls? It's treasury is like the primary responsibility, but who is looking into those things? Second line of defense, third line of defense. What are their roles and responsibilities? Who defined it? So this also enabled to have all these additional functionalities, additional teams to look after your reporting. Make sure you have a robust framework that is helpful for you to generate these reports in a timely fashion. On top of it, these are regulations, which means there are a lot of assumptions that go while you are interpreting these things, while generating the cash flows, projecting the cash flows. Are they consistently being generated within the firm? A lot of firms have legal entity structures, which means it could be a centralized process or it could be a decentralized process. So what kind of frameworks you have? Do you ensure all these regulatory guidance are consistently interpreted across your legal entities? And if so, how do you make sure they are consistently doing it? So that is where the assumptions and analytical frameworks will come in. If you don't understand, or if there is a gray area in the interpretation, how do you look to the industry? What are the best practices that are being adopted there, so that you are not far off when the Fed is really looking into your reports? Then Fed doesn't leave us there. It does a lot of quantitative and quantitative examination, which means they are coming back to the firms on a yearly basis. They are looking at each chunk, deposit ones, commitment ones, and they do a lot of these very detailed horizontal reviews. And if they find issues, then there are MRAs, which are very, very expensive for the firms to really resolve it and close those things. And finally, how operationally the firm is ready. Do they have the right SMEs, the right technology, the right data, the data being sourced at the right granularity? So all of these poses a lot of challenges for the firm to really adopt themselves. GSIBs, big firms have been doing this in the past 10, 12 years. Now it is the turn for tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 and other credit union financial institutions. 6G, in a nutshell. 3 things that they are trying to do. Standardize. Standardize all the regulatory interpretation, everything across various liquidity guidelines. There was LCR, there is NSFR, and then there is 2050-day, Basel, everything else. So the 6G, primarily they have focused is any discrepancy in their regulatory guidelines between these different regulatory agents, they try to consolidate. They closed all of them, or most of them. Second thing, they wanted to have more visibility into your balance sheet, which means they have added more products. The PEGs, which they call it in 2050, it went up from 118 to 146. Enormous segmentation of your balance sheet that you need to do. Then the data attributes. It used to be about 20, now it's 38, which means the cube size has grown by 3 times, 4 times, you name them. And all these new data attributes are getting into the lower level of your transactions, trying to understand what kind of transactions you have. Then you can see scope. Scope was previously NSFR was more balance sheet driven. LCR is short term. They have tried to close all those things. Try to link how your 2050 could be one bucket that catches all of these. So all of those, and I don't want to go into the details, but you can see how the products are being expanded. And what does it mean? It means it is going to impact each and every process of your firm, whether it's a business logic, whether you are sourcing the data properly, what kind of reconciliations you are doing, because now they are tying it very tight between your NSFR, LCR. Do you have different processes or do you have the same process? And how do you reconcile? So Fed doesn't want to look into your LCR numbers anymore. They just want your data down, and they can do whatever scenario they want to do. They can do an LCR, or they can do a customized LCR on your data based on how your firm is different from others. So which means all the policies, the standards that you have in your firm, every aspect of your firm is getting impacted. Yes. Okay. So, based on our experience, based on like the expertise we have at Python, we try to come up with like what would be an ideal target operating model. So when you are looking at treasury, don't look at like how we are trying to satisfy today's requirement. Look at like how we can build a framework that addresses most of your regulatory and other risk reporting requirements. We all know like there are tons of data sources that exist, whether it is because the firm has expanded over time or whether it is during acquisition or something. You can see all different business units and how they can source like the transaction level data. Then you have like the control data at the bottom. It's your legal entities or like any other constraints, your counterparties, your geographical, all those things. Once you have it, we know like treasury used to be just a profit and loss center 15 years back. It's no longer. Regulations made sure like it is responsible for generating all these regulatory reports, and it also does a lot of risk management, which is like the book management. How do you plan your balance sheet? How do you like execute it, and what kind of risk is it being operated in? So regulators in themselves like they place a lot of constraints, capital requirements, liquidity requirements, CCAR and other things. But on top of it, like treasury also wants to be like a smart center where they can manage how the FTP happens. So there is a lot of dynamic stuff that is happening in the treasury, which means like treasury should have its own view of the data, which could be like a golden source that would be used across all the reporting and risk requirements. As you guys have noticed, before liquidity, the market risk, credit risk, they used to have their own data, and that never reconciles with like treasury data. But with liquidity and with BCBS 239, you can see like everybody wants to have a more aggregated, consistent definition of data, which means like which has given birth to like treasury having its own data. So it has to like cleanse the data, standardize the data. It has to have the same data, which could be used both by the risk and the regulatory reporting. And what kind of data you want to store? You are doing a lot of cash flow projections. So there is a lot of historical data that you need to save, so that treasury can, on an ongoing basis, they can do a lot of back testing. They can refine their models, and ultimately they can save more on not having additional buffers, which I will explain shortly. Then you see, because they are doing regulatory, they are also doing a lot of risk, which means they have to have a lot of models where they have to model like behavioral cash flows, contractual cash flows, any other stress scenarios that they want to do. And all of that also resulted in having analytical models that are more catered toward the risk and towards the regulations that they are responsible for. And finally, we see reports, whether it is MI reports, whether it is regulatory reports, they are responsible for generating all these things. The two things I want to highlight, which are colored differently, is optimization criteria. Now, Treasury has built all these things, but are they doing a lot of optimization, utilizing the great or the wealth of information that they have accumulated as part of whether 2052A or some other reporting requirements? Which we notice a lot of people are not doing that ongoing optimization. And what does it mean ongoing optimization is how do you use this to save the cost, because there is a lot of investment that has happened in the last couple of years building these frameworks or equivalent frameworks. But are they really translating into your efficient balance sheet management? That is what we want to see. And to do that, there are certain features that are required in your data. Is your data capable to drill down? Are you able to understand where the variance is coming from on a day-to-day basis, or whatever periodic to period basis you're looking at? And what kind of dashboards you have created so that you are continuously monitoring that. So these two is where we think the future of treasury operations will be, and how you can leverage some of the good infrastructure that is built for the regulatory reporting. Here is one. So ultimately, there were a lot of speakers who have spoken this morning, and we have seen the LCR ratios and other ratios are going up. What does it mean? People or the firms are putting up more and more in their buffers. So if you see on the right side, the buffer is composed of two parts. One is the mandatory, let's say LCR 100%, LSFR 100%, and on top of it, you have this liquidity, additional incremental buffer. But why do you need an incremental buffer? Because you can stay at 100, but you will be breaching like 10 times in a week, or 10 times in a month. And you don't want to get into the Fed's attention that you are not managing your stuff. So obviously to overcome that, firms will come up with a certain amount of buffer, additional buffer, which means increased liquidity ratios or capital ratios. And what does it contribute? One is your balance sheet composition, how your assets and liabilities are there. Two is the volatility in cash flows. Three, you can see the legal entity structure, because there is a lot of firms are internationally being operated. So everybody is working on their own regulatory constraints. And the last one, you can see is what is the risk appetite? How often do you want to breach? Big firms say I want to breach only once in 25 years. What does it translate into? So your volatility plus you need to take X amount of standard deviation, so you will never breach those things. So to do that one, you are increasing your buffer size. But buffer is expensive, as other speakers spoke. Any additional $1 billion you are keeping, if you are taking a Fed rate of 25 bps, it costs at least 2.5 million. And it could be higher, more than that. But I'm saying is every $1 billion is costing on top of what has been invested to build all this regulatory reporting infrastructure. And during our experience, what we have noticed is there are a couple of areas where if Treasury can invest themselves and do an ongoing process, they can really minimize the buffer. Which means one, efficient balance sheet. Two is you're maximizing your profits because you're not spending much and you're efficiently doing your FTP. I'll deep dive into some of these. The first one is the firm models. What does firm models do? These models have been done long time back. Some of these were done some of these assumptions were built when the 4G or 3G has happened. Have we gone back and looked at it? Whether those assumptions still make sense? Have you actually looked at how your balance sheet has changed over time, how the markets have changed over time, and have you reflected that? Lot of firms, none. We can see is when we go and do some kind of conformance testing or other things, they say, oh, somebody 6 years, 7 years back, they have done it. There is no documentation. Whether it is applicable or not, nobody knows. So in the LCR, mainly from the 6G perspective, they are now the Fed is really asking what is your excess operational deposits, what methodology you are using, how are you doing your HQLA liquidation. All of these, they don't have a process. You have a firm specific process that should be tailored properly. Otherwise, a lot of your HQLA could be marked as non-HQLA, or you will be penalized with higher outflows. So firm models is something that you should ongoing basis, every year or every 2 quarters, you should go and you should revisit them. You should approve they are still applicable. The next thing is risk appetite. What is the risk appetite you have? LCR is 30 days, LSFR is 12 months. Do you have any other stress scenarios? Have you built that one so that you can ensure you're not just complying on two sides of the spectrum, right? So a lot of big firms have started developing internal liquidity stress scenarios, but it's it could be 60 days, 90 days, 120 days. How many more stress scenarios do you have? And what kind of sensitivity analysis are you doing? Because all these will help you to size your buffer, to size your assumptions, saying hey, LCR is one shot for all the firms, but this is how my firm operates, and I'm not going to put an additional because I have all these controls. So you should have a very tight, ongoing risk appetite models. Then the tools, as we just discussed, you should have ability to drill down, understand your variances, attribute that one, where it is coming from, different kinds of dashboards. EWI is early warning indicators. Everything is fine. There's a lot happening in the markets. But which one of them are mainly impacting your firm? Do you build it? Do you proactively look at the indices that will have a profound impact on your portfolio? So if you don't do it, then it will be post-mortem only. Everything happens, then there is crazy changes in your book, And since you will be breaching like all these ratios, you will be like in the eyes of the Fed, and like a lot of MRAs, CRAs, CLARs will come. So firms have started like really looking at building these DWI models, whether it is based on the market indices or based on like the firm specific indicators. You build these models, you monitor on a daily basis. If there is a certain volatility breaches in these indices, like inflation, interest rates, all those things, you need to capture them, and you need to go back to your business units, and you need to look at it like, does it still make sense, or should I like, change my buffers? The processes, obviously there is like a lot of legal entity structures, which means it could be centralized or decentralized. If it is decentralized, how consistent you are in terms of your interpretation, in terms of like applying these, implementing those things, and then do you have like a second line of defense and third line of defense, and how integrated they are with your process, how often they are like improving your processes. And the last one is like all these things should go into your planning. The planning is like FLP. It happens once in a year, but it may not be applicable as you are like the markets are changing. And it could be like what is your contingent fund planning, like, because these are the ones that drive how much additional buffer you need to have. Which means these are all translating into your risk appetite, into your operations, and into your like new products or like product composition changes. So we think like if enough efforts are incrementally put into all these things, the beauty of like 2052A and what you could do beyond that one would be reaped by the firms. And obviously to do all these things, data is the key. You can see like you should have an accurate data, a consistent data definition, and like how timely it is. And this is where like Mike will walk you through like some more details.
I'll switch places with you, thanks, Chandra. So I think as Jay highlighted earlier in his presentation, the Fed is clearly becoming more data intensive, data driven in how they approach things. And Chandra just walked you through kind of showcasing some of the uplift from 5G to 6G that really demonstrates that. So we've all seen the analogy, if you can see this, it's a crude iceberg, and we've all seen the analogy that with the tip of the iceberg above the water, and then the majority of the mass is floating beneath the surface, largely unseen. And so the way we kind of liken that to this conversation is, the tip of the iceberg is the regulatory reporting requirements and the compliance activities that have to happen ultimately. But what's important and where we really need to focus overall from a strategic standpoint is the mass beneath the surface, which is having the right posture in terms of how we get the data management underpinning the program correct. So the enterprise data management, data governance, I'd say there's a lot more probably underneath the surface, but like things like process and operational excellence, things we're always striving for constantly in our organization, certainly come into play here. But really want to call out data management as a key component because it's also heavily integrated in how you manage your processes. And I think the Adenza folks kind of highlighted that as well, as how it's important to have that front to back backbone that supports the overall process. So this table here at the bottom, a lot of words, probably small print, hard to read for a lot of people. This will be available later. I'll speak to it at a high level, but this is our data management capability model or framework that we use to kind of just decompose data management into some more digestible subtopics within it. And we're not the first ones to ever do this. There's a lot of data management industry frameworks out there, whether it's EDM Council, they have the DCAM framework, Carnegie Mellon has a data management framework, DAMA, the Data Management Association, they have a very good technical-oriented framework as well. So lots of different ways to slice and dice data management into its subcomponents, but a couple, we'll talk about ours today, but in some of your organizations, I'm sure are aligned to one of these frameworks I mentioned, or you've created your own. But what you will see as a commonality across any industry framework is going to be data governance. Maybe you could say data quality also, but when we talk about data governance, we're really talking about the human organization that goes into managing and overseeing the data, which is kind of a weird definition sometimes. Sometimes people challenge me on that, but it's we're talking about the policies and standards around data. We're talking about a lot of those second line type activities from a traditional governance standpoint, and really driving the adoption and maturity. One thing I like about DAMA's data management maturity model is that they take it, instead of a boring table like ours, it's called the data wheel. And so the hub at the center of the wheel is data governance, and around it are their other 10 subcomponent areas that they've broken data management down into. So a lot of people actually interchangeably get data governance and data management confused, but ultimately data management is the overarching initiative, and then data governance is one aspect of data management, which a nuance, but still an important one. And so anytime we're thinking about any of these dimensions, we always have to think about it from a people, process, and technology. And I think Don earlier was talking a lot about technology, and the Adenza speaker as well also spoke on the technology and the enablement and the tools. We have a saying, finding the fool with the tool is still fool. So it's really important that you don't think that a tool is going to be the panacea to whatever your challenges or issues are. They can be enablers and accelerators, but you've got to go in really understanding. You have to have the right use cases and kind of think strategically. So if you've never implemented a tool, I strongly suggest you get a partner or hire people on your team that have done it and they've maybe failed or messed up a couple times so that you can have those lessons learned so that you can be set up for success. And then on the people aspect, I think we spoke on a panel yesterday about data, all roads oftentimes seem to lead to data, no matter what we talk about, but one of the panels we were talking about people, and in particular we focus a lot on culture. And so culture means a lot of things. The culture of the organization, liking the people you work with, that's not actually the culture I'm talking about. It's more like the culture of how change affects people. And so if you understand how change affects people, then you can have a higher success of implementing the data management program, implementing roles and responsibilities around reg reports and reg change. So often that emotional intelligence, that aspect that makes people change jobs during the Great Resignation and things like that, that's a big aspect of how we approach things, the softer side as well as the academic side. And obviously we talked about processes and operational excellence, which heavily integrated in everything else. But some of the other components I'll talk about very quickly because they are important. And ultimately the messaging here is that you need a strong data management program underpinning it, and don't focus in on just the iceberg. And I don't know, by show of hands, how many people work at a Category 1 bank? I don't think I've seen a lot. A couple of hands. What about Category 2, 3, 4? Okay, quite a few more. And who doesn't know? Thanks for being honest. Yeah, it's so if you are involved with 2052A, you probably know. And if you're Category 1, you definitely know because your deadline is in May. So yeah, so you have to be reporting, whether it's in a really strategic manner or a hybrid tactical, you have a deadline. So you can't always do things the way we would, ideally if we had unlimited time and resources, we would want to do it. So completely understand this is all great, but enterprise data management is a journey. It takes forever. So if you go in saying, well, we're going to do it, then you're not going to be able to run the business at the same time that you're trying to change the business. So if you're Category 2, 3, 4, you have until October, still a very short timeline. The uplift over 5G, while significant, probably doesn't feel quite as painful as 5G felt, I imagine. I don't know, does anyone agree or disagree with that? Everyone agrees then. Okay, cool. And so some of the other components, data structure, the definition of the data. And this stuff we could really go down a rabbit hole. I've got 6 more minutes here, so I've got to speed up. But this stuff is these are really important tenets. You got to get the governance right to really get everything else right. But data structure, the definition of the data or the meaning of the data, data architectures are how we store, move, and retrieve data. Master and metadata management, you can probably throw reference data in there as well, but the management of consistent data content definitions across the enterprise. Data quality, accuracy, completeness, and legal compliance of the data. Data security, the protection of data, and the authorization to use the data, which is ever more important. Oftentimes, you have the InfoSec team kind of butts heads with data, but you have a lot of PII involved in processes, and now we have a lot of new data privacy rules. And additionally, your access control, something often always overlooked as well, are more important than ever because of this rising cybersecurity threats. So if there is a compromise, hopefully you can kind of limit or contain it if you have better data security in place. And then of course this last but not least, the analytics piece. And I tried asking a couple people, there's a book I probably read too many books, but there was a book, I think it was a Michael Lewis book, and it talked about the creation of the data scientist role. And I think it was Facebook. If anyone knows this book after I tell the story, then please let me know. But I think it was Facebook. They had a lot of data analysts and business analyst roles posted, and they weren't getting the quantity or quality of applicants they wanted. So they just changed the title of data scientist, and suddenly applicants exploded. Didn't change anything comp or anything else about it, and that was credited as the origin of the term data scientist. And as a data management and a risk practitioner, I'm often involved in those pure data science communities, and brilliant people, leading edge in the AI, machine learning, and all those things. A lot of times they don't have the full appreciation and understanding of enterprise data management, and a lot of times they feel like, well, enterprise data management doesn't move fast enough for my needs. So we still have to kind of ground it back in. Analytics is a component of data management at the end of the day. So how do we manage that as well? And I guess the last piece to highlight on that is we're not doing these things in a vacuum. So in the process of doing your liquidity reporting for regulatory purposes, you're doing a lot of work. You're increasing your granularity of your analysis and how aggregation's happening. You think there's other business value we can get out of it? I think I alluded earlier from the back of the room, but I actually some of the foreign banking organizations, they changed their global booking model so that they could actually fall back below that Category 4 threshold, so that they wouldn't have to do 6G, right? But they were already doing 2052A, so for those organizations, it was interesting because they saw business value from the increased granularity of reporting they were doing, so they continued doing a lot of it, even though they're no longer required. So there is absolutely value to get out of this, but we have to kind of keep our eye on the prize that we have a deadline. We have to hit that deadline. We have to do it right. The last thing we want is different versions of the truth of our data, and we don't want a regulator or auditor to find it before we do, if it exists. So a lot of things to balance. And 3 more minutes. Okay. So we've all seen pictures like this. So if we look at, lots of different disparate systems at the front of the house. The data gets aggregated and transformed and enriched, and ultimately gets consumed into various reporting processes, whether it's finance, performance, or risk. And I'm not going to go through drain all these. These slides are going to be available, but a lot of times organizations find that every time there's some need or requirement, sometimes it is a tactical one-off thing, and maybe it makes sense to just throw people and Excel at it. But if it's something that's ultimately going to drive a change or business value and make its way into BAU, then it's not a very strategic component. And you do that enough times, you start to pile all those manual, uncontrolled processes where data is being extracted, calculations are happening, being put back in a report or in a database somewhere else. And so you end up with all these different versions of the truth. And so we maybe for a decade or so over-romanticize golden sourcing of data, but the overall tenet or principle still applies. We just can't be so strict necessarily all the time about it, and just recognize that it's a continuous improvement or maturity over time. But some of the common challenges are over-reliance on financial reporting for managing information. I think in the early days of CeFPro, it was a heavy lean on the finance teams to do a lot of the reporting that had to happen. Manually intensive data collection, reconciliation, reporting, as I kind of already alluded to. Challenges with managing business performance. Actually, it's interesting in recent years, 10 years ago or so, we were having MF Global and some other high-profile failures. And then the last couple of years, we've had a lot of other high-ish profile failures like Archegos and Greensill and some other things. And so those left investment banks, the most sophisticated some of the most sophisticated financial institutions in the world, holding hundreds of millions, or in some cases many billions of dollars of losses. And a lot of it, when they start asking themselves why, they're saying, well, we have almost analysis paralysis, not even analysis paralysis, we're so overwhelmed with all the reporting, all the metrics, all the analysis we're doing. How do we make sense of it and actually use it to drive business decisions? And if so much of it is focused on the regulatory outcome, how are we actually feeding that back into our business decisions and our risk processes? So do we truly understand? Are we just going through the motions so that we can fill out a risk report or a reg report? Or can we actually say, okay, this client represents this much inherent risk. These are our mitigating factors, but is that enough? Are we comfortable bearing this additional risk? And are we looking at all the different dimensions that may lurk below the surface? So I think, and to kind of close that point with 10 seconds ago, the key message is there are common requirements across all these silos. So you have a lot of different reports and outputs that come from them, but if you look at the different dimensions and data inputs and risk details and different calculation drivers, there's a lot of commonality between these. And so that's where you end up with those, different versions of truth of data. And so, and even redundant work and effort and things like that. So how do we bring it all back and centralize it? The most loaded ending to a presentation ever, probably. But that's part of the journey and challenge, so we can handle the tactical things that we have to do today, but always keeping our eye on the true prize, which is longer term, continuously improving our organization. So, I don't know if there's time for questions, but okay. So, any questions, comments? Chandra's a smarter one, so ask him.
I want to go back to the point you made a moment ago on behavior. Just looking through satisfying regulation and actually impacting behavior. My question is, if your bank complying with 6G and we go, let's say 5 years down the road, what's going to be the difference between your behavior versus those banks that don't have to comply with 6G?
It's an interesting perspective and question. I think there's already a nature difference in the type of organizations that fit into those two populations, right? So the ones that do have to do it are already larger, more complex organizations by design. I think part of the reason why the small organizations don't have to do it is just the burden on the organization to actually do it. And for those peripheral organizations, that's why we see so much merger and acquisition activity, because you just have to get bigger to be able to support all this stuff. So I don't know if it'll actually mean that smaller organizations that are doing 6G are less covered from a risk management or liquidity risk management standpoint. Typically, those small organizations are less complex as well. So I think we'll still see more of the headline events and loss events happening with the large organizations, even though they are doing it. I think the other idea is that Fed becoming more data driven is going to have a lot more inputs to kind of monitor systemic risk, which ultimately takes 1,000 mid-sized banks in the U.S. Their balance sheets all combined don't add up to J.P. Morgan. So it's a lot easier just to regulate them and set a standard there than it is to try and cover up much more digestible failures. Chandra,
It's the complexity of the products, right? Like, as he's saying, J.P. Morgan or Goldman Sachs, they have like this intricate derivatives and other stuff, and that is going to cause a lot more volatility in the markets compared to the smaller banks, which are very stable. Like, they have either deposits or loans or very simple products. So as you see, like, from 5G to 6G, that one of the focus they have expanded is on the derivatives. They brought in like a lot more granularity into how the derivatives are reported, and the prime broad price has been taken off, and it is being done. So why they are doing is like, they want to closely monitor these big firms and try to understand what is the complexity of products they have and how often they are looking into those things. If you don't have like a 16% on this GSIPs, maybe they are not doing the right level of risk monitoring or risk appetite on that. That is like, that was the reason why the daily reporting requirement came in, and even like the rate at which like the data has to be reported is like T+2, which is not like you're not looking at like a lot more stale data. You're looking more relevant data.
So I suggest that the more complex organizations will actually be able to say whether promise of data analytics delivers, because they will have much better data.
Exactly.
They'll figure it out. Let's do the data analytics. So the 6G firms will be able to tell you, yeah, data analytics is for real.
And I'll give you an example. I was working at a big GSIP. So there was a horizontal review going on. So they asked like, give us data. We were able to give 97% of the portfolio. They asked, where is the other 3%? They said, oh, it is somewhere. We'll get it in 2-3 days. They are not at it. You are having about $20 trillion of derivatives, and you don't know where 3% of your data is. So they were like, fine. Heavy fines are being levied on these guys because they don't have like systems. They don't monitor it. So if they are not imposing, the firms are not voluntarily doing like all this required system upgrades on a timely fashion.
Right, so it's kind of a lever to get data management.
Data management is the key, right?
Actually implemented throughout the bank.
correct. Any other questions? Yeah.
I mean, I see it under the data continues accuracy. Can you give an example of like how you ensure accuracy of data?
Okay, so there's a few different dimensions to it. So from a governance standpoint, we implement data owners and data stewards. So we have people attesting to it. How are they attesting to it? So there are data certification processes that we can put in place that enable us to say with confidence that at least for this critical or impactful data that we're talking about here, we've done these things to ensure the data is not only accurate but complete and timely and so on. So an example might be you have a set of data, you've decomposed some critical reports, and you've identified data that ultimately gets aggregated or feeds into those reports. And so you say, okay, this is important data, so we're going to assign that data to a data owner or to a data owner. Then that data owner will appoint a steward, and that steward will work with the business and the data office to come up with a business definition of that, which I think we've talked about is a harder exercise than most people appreciate. Come up with a business definition, understand at the very least, the conceptual or logical use of that data. How's it being produced? Where is it being consumed downstream? And then from there, we can also look at what business processes are used in, what are the controls around those processes. Is it effectively controlled? And we can do design and operational effectiveness testing around it. And then we can evidence that we go through this process and that we have an ongoing methodology of doing this consistently at the element level and at the data domain level more largely. So at a high level, we can do all that, and then we're developing KPIs or measures around our data to show us our data hygiene. And what's cool about when you measure things and put metrics in place, things tend to improve. So I need to start weighing myself, and then I think my weight will improve if I take my own advice. But does that answer your question?
And I'll just add with the KPIs, right? One of the things is how many of your data elements are being defaulted. Like you are doing manual overrides. If you are doing so many of them, 20% or 10%, 5%, how are you measuring it? These are some of the measures you look at it. If your data is somewhere is not properly mapped, because you do a lot of aggregations, and then you try to take it different views, right? There is one process that is used for daily reporting versus one for quarterly and monthly. Is it all reconciling? Where is the problem coming in? There are a lot of places where we have looked at is the manual overrides because the data is not there, timely data is not there. So all this we translate into KPIs that will measure the accuracy of how good your data is.
And over time, taking it back to the source, as close to the source as possible, inherently your data quality will improve over time.
To what extent do you see integration of data lineage, which kind of answers your problem, where the 3% of the data,
Everything.
with with the instrumentation, basically saying, yeah, this is how data flows through the organization. These are the control points. And this is why a data steward at the start may know this data is accurate, but 4 hops later, these are the controls that we have to know that the data is still accurate. Right? Because my thought is data lineage is often just a map. This is how I get from a reporting system to a source system. Are you seeing the data lineage thing is then enhanced to say, these are the controls, not the ways to roll the control?
Yeah, exactly. We need to understand what are the parameters and what are the business requirements tied to the data across each of those hops of the lineage chain. And yeah, exactly. Very well said.
Right. But still, I have a question. Are you seeing that the industry is saying these are the control points in the lineage, or are you just seeing that lineages are just they're just maps?
That's best practice. Yeah, absolutely. That's standard. I think where the shortfall, in my opinion, is the data that we're actually doing it. So we're doing it really well on the data under the microscope. There's a lot of data not under the microscope. And so we're letting reg reporting oftentimes is our driver of critical data. We're very passionate about saying you should look at the business processes themselves, identify impactful data in those processes, and let that drive your process, and have a good data dictionary or catalog and integrate it with your business glossary so that we can start to kind of get that almost nervous system across the bank. But if you only look at regulatory, it's almost like you have your binders up. We're doing really well on what we're looking at, but there's it's still stuff.
Still garbage.
Yeah. We all talk about business owned and starting at the source, but I would say, 10 years post the initial BCBS 239 consultation, I'm not seeing a lot, even the most prestigious banks, I'm not seeing a lot of true success enterprise-wide at actually getting back to those things that we kind of parrot all the time. But it's a journey. Great points. All right. Any other questions?
Michael, Chandra, thank you very much, that was great. Okay, we are on lunch break. We're going to be losing one of our speakers this afternoon, so if you turn about 1:10-ish, so to speak.
What's your name?
Like 1:10.
I gotta run back to
Maybe
the
sort of on
listen
schedule.
to it.
Thanks a lot.
What's your name?
You gotta get your phone.
Right next to me. Good luck. What's your last name? Oh, yeah, you're on. I didn't know you were.